Well, thank you very much, Simon and Victoria, for the invitation once again. Gladly, the storm has passed by. It didn't seem to impact it. We're all still here. The tent is still here. So what I want to do now is bring you back straight away to the end of January 1921. And this is when Mary Lindsay, a well-connected loyalist living near Coachford, took the decision to intervene in the ongoing conflict by preventing an IRA ambush in Dripsey, near Dripsey, with the intention, the best of intentions, to avert bloodshed on all sides. And on learning of the planned ambush, she met the like-minded local priest, Father Shinnick, who was overtly hostile to the IRA campaign, and he agreed to notify the IRA flying column that their position was known. So for her part, she drove with her chauffeur to the police station in Ballincollig and revealed the IRA's position. Now, that information was immediately relayed to the British Army, and they immediately mobilized a unit to engage the ambushers, who were routed. 10 arrests were made, 5 of whom were court-martialed and earmarked for execution. Although aware of the dangers, she remained in the area. She even visited General Strickland in Cork City a few days later. This is recorded in his diary. And she told him she feared the IRA knew she was the informer. And indeed, they found out. They might not have known exactly at that stage, but they certainly found out soon enough. And she and her chauffeur, Clark, were picked up by members of the local IRA at 1 a.m. on the 17th of February and held near Dunman as hostages. And they were held in various cottages in the Dunman area over the next weeks. And to avert the impending executions, and this was the primary objective of the 6th Battalion leadership at the time, they drew up letters, including a note signed by Mrs. Lindsay, and this was dispatched to General Strickland, indicating that her life would be in danger if the executions proceeded. And again, thankfully, we can go back to Strickland's diary, and in the diary he reveals, tragically, that the letter arrived after the executions had taken place. They didn't know at that point about this letter. The letter arrived after the 5 executions had already taken place. So the letter could have no bearing on the event. Significantly, the bodies of these 5 IRA prisoners were never returned to the relatives, but instead they were packed into a lorry, transported to Cork jail, buried in ground which is now part of the UCC University campus. So this point is marked as a Republican memorial on the spot. Now, it remained unclear as to what had happened to Mrs. Lindsay in the coming weeks. And her sister, Ethel Benson, wrote to De Valera on the 6th of July 1921. This would be some months later. And she requested that he issue orders for her immediate release, quote, or if this will not be conceded, that she should be permitted to communicate with her relatives, close quote. and if not, that she, her sister, should at least be informed of the circumstances of her death. Cathal Brewer, the Minister for Defence, finally responded to Ethel Benson on the 29th of July 1921 as follows, quote, "Madam, in accordance with instructions from the President, I have made inquiries from our local commanders into the case of Mrs. Lindsay. The information sent us is that she was executed as a spy some months ago. The charge against her was that she was directly responsible for conveying to the enemy information which led to the execution of 5 of our men by the British authorities, to the death of a 6th from wounds received in action, and to a sentence of 25 years penal servitude passed upon the 7th. Mrs. Lindsay wrote a letter to General Strickland pointing out the consequences to herself should our men be executed. They were executed nevertheless. 5 days after their execution in Cork Barracks, the sentence which had been passed on Mrs. Lindsay and suspended pending General Strickland's reply was duly carried out. We regret the circumstances and the stern necessity to protect our forces which necessitated this drastic action by our local commanders." Close quote. Now, a second letter from Mrs. Lindsay to Strickland was drawn up around the 8th of March, seeking the release of the surviving prisoners. There were 2 surviving prisoners in custody. And it remains possible that this is why greater clemency was shown to the surviving prisoners. Dennis Murphy, who got 25 years penal servitude instead of the death sentence, so that was better at least, and of course he was released soon after the conflict was over. James Barrett, however, was not fit to stand trial and subsequently died in custody on the 22nd of March 21, but his body at least was returned to the relatives, in contrast to the earlier 5 cases where they were not. So this second letter implies she was still alive on the 8th of March, although her home, Leamount House, was burnt to the ground by members of the 6th Battalion on the night of the 12th to the 13th of March 1921. Leamount House would be a smaller, big house, if you know what I mean. It's not a big house, but it certainly would fit into the category of the big houses burnt in Cork. Now, when Mrs. Benson published Brewer's post-truce response in the press, the matter was subsequently raised in both houses of the British Parliament in London. And Mrs. Lindsay was lionised on the British side as an exemplary loyalist citizen. In the House of Lords, the Earl of Selborne even compared her to Nurse Cavell, who had been shot as a spy by the Germans during the First World War. Lindsay was described as, quote, "nothing less than a martyr in the eyes of the whole empire," close quote. Now, her execution, nonetheless, remained controversial within the IRA. General Crozier, who resigned from the Auxiliary Division in March 1921, in an account indicated that in a subsequent conversation he had with Michael Collins, Collins, expressed remorse about the execution of Mrs. Lindsay, and he alleged that it was not referred to him, which it should have been if protocol was followed, and that he was unlikely to have sanctioned it on any account because of her age. Mrs. Lindsay was 60 years of age. Collins, however, had been informed in writing, and this correspondence survives, she had been informed on the 15th of March 1921 by the brigade adjutant of the Cork No. 1 Brigade. The 6th Battalion would be in the Cork 1 Brigade area. This was Florence O'Donoghue, and this communication indicated that James Clark had been dealt with in, quote, the usual way, close quote. And somewhat less probably that Mrs. Lindsay, who was too old for deportation, was dying, and the local battalion commandant proposed to hold her till she died. Furthermore, the communication sought approval for this course of action from GHQ in Dublin. Incidentally, there was a directive that women spies were not to be shot; they were to be deported, and this is what it was at question here. And so the Cork 1 Brigade was trying to make it look like they were conforming to IRA protocol in this matter. However, this account is completely at variance with the subsequent report on her death by the OC of the Cork 1 Brigade, Sean O'Hegarty. This alleged that they were both shot together, Clark and Lindsay, and they were buried in the same grave. And this is an altogether more likely scenario, since it's corroborated by testimony of Frank Bustede, the 6th Battalion Flying Column leader who supervised the executions. So in other words, she was already dead when this letter was written on the 15th of March by the OC of the 1st Cork Brigade. Now, of course, unsurprisingly, as a result of this, there was some confusion in Dublin at GHQ as to her fate. At this stage, GHQ was also becoming concerned with adverse propaganda. The Morning Post declared on the 10th of August that it was a long time since anything had so moved their readers as the exposure of the facts on the foul murder of Mrs. Lindsay. The Unionist press were also following the case with interest, more especially given Clark's origins in County Down. Clark was an Ulsterman, and he worked for Mr. Lindsay, the late Mr. Lindsay. Mrs. Lindsay was a widow, and her ex-husband, or her late husband, was part of the great linen family, the Lindsays of County Down. The newsletter noted that while no charge had been revealed against him, he, Clark, was a Protestant. Now, if Lindsay was guilty of passing information by IRA definitions, at least, to Crown Forces, Clark, by any standards, was entirely innocent. But it was unlikely he was killed for sectarian reasons, but simply because if he was released, if he and she were released, they knew too much. Moreover, having communicated the intention to execute both hostages if the 5 prisoners were executed, the Cork 1 Brigade leadership felt it was necessary to follow through. Holding prisoners from which nothing further could be gained also posed dangers for the IRA. They didn't have a prison structure, in contrast to the British, who had 4,000 prisoners, IRA prisoners, by the end of the War of Independence. The IRA couldn't resort to that particular strategy. Now, despite extensive investigations, after the War of Independence, her remains were never recovered. They've never been recovered to this day. Yet the Manchester Regiment, the regiment in Ballincollig, who successfully foiled the ambush as a result of her information, the Manchester Regiment did not let her memory fade. On the 28th of January 1922, exactly a year to the day after the foiled ambush, rather than her actual death, a memorial service was held in Ballincollig Garrison Church to acknowledge her role in this successful military operation. The commanding officer recalled that, quote, "This was the first occasion on which the tables were turned on a rebel ambush party." Now, as this was going on, at the same time, a larger public memorial service was held at St. Mary's Cathedral in Limerick, a much bigger event, which concluded with the last post. Normally, this is reserved for fallen members of the Crown Forces. And these military displays, combined with the failure to return the 5 IRA prisoners' bodies, may explain why the leadership of the 6th Battalion were determined not to return Mrs. Lindsay's body, as her memory had become part of the propaganda war, a centrally important feature of the conflict in which nationalists certainly got the upper hand. But the case of Mrs. Lindsay and the Dripsy ambush were major reversals for the IRA. Mrs. Lindsay in the case of propaganda. And the IRA column in that area was stood down. It was effectively rendered ineffective by the foiled ambush, and it didn't operate again. Now, the tragedy of the case was that in reality, she had not intervened in order to strike a blow for the British Empire, but to save lives on both sides. But, of course, it had precisely the opposite effect. That's the tragedy. Not only did it lead to her own death and that of Clark, but it also led to 5 British military executions of IRA prisoners. That, in turn, was followed by 5 IRA reprisals, where they successfully killed a number of British soldiers in Cork. 5 British soldiers were shot in Cork shortly afterwards. A further Crown Force reprisal on an IRA member, while another IRA man did not recover from his injuries and died in custody. So this trail of needless deaths exemplifies the viciousness of the conflict in Cork at its peak and the unwillingness of either side to compromise in this matter. So how typical was this case? It was completely untypical. Very few women were disappeared, although, of course, we know about the case of Mrs. Noble in the Beara Peninsula, which Eve Morrison is working on and talked about here last year. But Mrs. Lindsay's high social status made this particular case unusual. She was one of the highest status victims of the whole conflict in Cork. In addition to the fact that it can be firmly established that she passed information, that is incontrovertible. It was stated in the House of Commons, and it is entered in Strickland's diary. And that is not possible in many instances. Now, what do we know about the wider pattern of disappearances? And that's what I want to talk about now. I'll broaden things out. Let's look at the bigger picture. Well, Jim Donnelly and myself have so far documented 62 disappearances in County Cork during the course of the Irish Revolution. 62. Okay? And undoubtedly, there are a few more out there. But we think that is most of them. But there are certainly a few others which we've failed to capture in our project. Now, first of all, the great majority took place in the War of Independence. This accounted for 49 of the 62, while the period of the truce accounted for the far smaller balance. The other significant thing is that 28 of the 62 were Crown forces. So the majority, so to speak, were civilian disappearances. 28 of the 62 were from the Crown forces. And perhaps the most notable feature of the geography of these disappearances was that over 74% took place in the Cork 1 Brigade area. The Cork 1 Brigade area dominated the casualties, so to speak. 74% of these disappearances were carried out in the Cork 1 Brigade area. So this brigade resorted to using the tactic of disappearing people far more than brigades elsewhere in Ireland or indeed elsewhere in Cork. It was off the scale. Now, of course, the issue in the historiography is best known through the Gerard Murphy's book, The Year of Disappearances. And the argument made by Murphy is that the Cork IRA disappeared many more people than have been documented by historians, particularly during the truce period. For Murphy, the so-called Year of Disappearances takes place from the truce and the year that followed. And he believes abductions, killings, disappearances, the ones we know about, are only the tip of the iceberg. And during the second half of 1921, he argues secret abductions, execution, and secret burial became the favoured weapon of the IRA, in contrast to the practice in the War of Independence of shooting them in the street, as this would have breached the truce. The truce was on, so if someone was disappeared, it didn't breach the truce. This is the argument he's making. Now, he also speculates that many more were disappeared, in particular in the spring and summer of 1922, when the anti-IRA, anti-treaty IRA, controlled Cork City, that there were a much larger number of disappearances in that particular period during the so-called truce. Now, two theories Murphy advances are that, firstly, a series of killings identified in IRA accounts, such as those by Connie Neenan, and Murphy, for example, who was directing the 2nd Battalion in Cork City, that these events, which they allege happened in the War of Independence, in Murphy's view, Gerard Murphy's view, actually happened during the truce. In other words, the evidence was somehow being falsified by the IRA to cover up these disappearances during the truce period. This is the argument that Murphy is essentially making, Gerard Murphy. Secondly, he believes that various Protestant groups constituted the core element in scores of these undocumented post-truce IRA disappearances, notably Freemasons, whom he claims can be identified and, quote, authenticated as they were struck off Freemason registers in this period. In other words, the Freemason records shows that a number of Freemasons were struck off their lists between 1920 and 1926. The Knockgraha IRA company reputedly carried out many of these undocumented killings. The claims made in regard to these many spies and informers killed by the Knockgraha company and disappeared by them are, however, I would argue, somewhat suspect. Why? Firstly, because the key informant, Martin Corry, the captain of the Knockgraha company, was a very unreliable witness. And it was he who shaped much of the Knockgraha narrative. Corry, for example, states in a letter he wrote to the Secretary of the Military Service Pension Board that the vast majority of Crown forces, civilian spies, etc., captured in Cork No. 1 Brigade were sent there during 1919, 1920 and 1921. Now, that claim is entirely false, as can be seen from all the disappeared victims that we have documented nowhere near Knockgraha. Ned Maloney, who was the prison warder in the prison called Sing Sing in the graveyard crypt in near Knockgraha, he clearly indicated that Sing Sing, the prison, was shut down. Quote, "The day of the truce finished it," he said. So that aspect of the Knockgraha story relates entirely to the War of Independence. So while it's likely that some more prisoners were executed at Knockgraha than have been documented, I think that's certainly the case. Because Sing Sing was shut down in the truce, and this is the testimony of the prison warder, Ned Maloney, they are far more likely to have occurred in the War of Independence, not in the period Gerard Murphy's talking about, the truce, but in the War of Independence. That's when the prison was operating. And this conforms to the wider pattern we have discerned overall, where the War of Independence accounted for 74% of all documented disappearances in Cork. So if there is other undocumented disappearances, we argue that they're likely to follow the same pattern as the documented ones, with 74% being the great majority being in the War of Independence. Okay. In contrast to Murphy, we contend that the disappearances actually contracted considerably in the truce period, in line with the general contraction of killing all over Ireland and indeed in Cork also. And this might also explain very simply why Murphy finds far less evidence for disappearances in the truce period. There's no evidence because there's very little disappearances happening, not because there's some great cover-up by the IRA in this period. And that the Cork 1 Brigade was disappearing scores of Freemasons, presumably all Protestants. Maybe there were one or two Catholics, but I assume they were mostly or all Protestants. That argument is being proven to be fairly erroneous by Keane's detailed research on this topic. Keane has used genealogical sources to follow up all of these Freemasons who were struck off, and surprise, surprise, the great majority of them are found to be live and well and living in Leeds and London or moving to Dublin, and are struck off because they didn't pay their fee, or they moved to another area, or they had just decided that maybe it was time to leave the Freemasons. Simple as that. Okay? So that argument is entirely fallacious. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and Keene's work has effectively demolished it. Now, that theory, quite frankly, is unhelpful because it creates deep misunderstanding, not least because they imply the IRA was deeply sectarian in targeting its victims. Now, Corrie, we'll go back to Corrie now. Corrie claimed in the activities file for the Knockgraha Company for pension purposes in the 1930s, he claimed that about 27 enemy spies and intelligence officers were captured and executed at Knockgraha. Now, I should point out that this stated number over the following years, the following decades, was subsequently inflated. So that by the 1970s, when Corrie was interviewed, a recorded interview was made. These survive in the Cork archives, for those who would like to listen to them. And in the 1970s, Corrie states that there were over 35 disappearances, a higher number. And these included 7 TANs, EGRIC, and 17 to 18 Cameron Highlanders. This was the British Army regiment then stationed in Cove, who were covering the Knockgraha area. So Corrie claims to have been disappearing large numbers of these British soldiers. Now, to me, it seems highly unlikely that 17 to 18 British soldiers disappeared without more of them surfacing in available records. Moreover, Corrie's claim to have killed the Cameron Highlander called Mackintosh has been demonstrated by Gerard Murphy himself to have been an entirely false claim. And that is one of Murphy's, to credit him, it's one of his very important findings. But if you follow on from that, if Corrie was talking nonsense in terms of Mackintosh, who else is he talking nonsense about? If so many were disappeared, a number would have appeared on British Army missing lists, or the list of IRA executions drawn up by the IRA. The IRA drew up lists of those they executed. Moreover, if 18 British soldiers went missing, and we have many missing soldiers all over the rest of Cork, there also would be letters surviving for relatives who came looking for them 6 months later, a year later, 18 months later. And we have those letters in the archives for other parts of Cork, but lo and behold, there is very few for Knockgraha. Why are the relatives not coming to look for their loved ones who are missing? Now, in the pension claim by Maloney, now this is incidentally available online now, he states a few other things that are not in line with Corrie's statements. Corrie claims in the 1970s that Maloney had a sheet with all the names written on the sheet. Now, I'd love to get my hands on that sheet, but that would be interesting if it survives, but I don't think it does. And Corrie states that everybody who went through Knockgraha and was executed was named on that sheet, and he heard Maloney reel off the names to the pension board. Now, going through the pension records, and we can go through Maloney's claim, there's no mention of a list. And moreover, Maloney for his part, said he didn't know who many of them were. So all in all of these things collectively raise major question marks about the veracity of many of Corrie's claims. And maybe we need to be far more circumspect about evidence that has been provided by Corrie on this particular issue. And if you take out Corrie's evidence, the numbers come down considerably, and more sober estimates might be made of those who disappeared in Knockra. And undoubtedly there are some whose names we still don't have, but I don't think it's as large as Corrie claims. So some concluding remarks. From our research on documented disappearances, which we think account for the majority of disappeared victims, they took place over a wide area across County Cork, but more notably within Cork 1 Brigade area, which did cover a large part of the county, it has to be said, with a concentration on the south side of the city, the southern suburbs, the rural area around the south of the city. This seems to have been a dumping ground for the 2nd Battalion. Now, while Gerard Murphy did correctly identify that the boy Parsons had been disappeared in the spring of 1922 and not in 1921, we think he is incorrect to assume that this was part of a systematic pattern of deception to cover up scores of undocumented truce period killings. In contrast to Murphy, we don't think there's some kind of sectarian smoking gun in the Cork number 1 Brigade disappearing strategy. 20 Catholics and 6 Protestants were disappeared by the Cork IRA in the War of Independence. 20 Catholics and 6 Protestants during the War of Independence. Now, the truce period ones are different. The Dunman Way Massacre in 1922 alters the figures. I believe that attack was a manifestly sectarian attack, but it was very different to the pattern up to this point, and it's not at all typical. But as a consequence of that attack, 3 were disappeared at the beginning of the Dunman Way Massacre, the first 3 Protestant victims. And that skews the figures to some extent. In the truce, 3 Catholics and 5 Protestants were disappeared. 3 Catholics, 5 Protestants. 3 occurred as a result of the Dunman Way Massacre. So 3 of the 5 occurred as a result of that. Now, why are there so many disappearances in County Cork relative to the rest of the country? Una O'Halpin, unfortunately, I don't think he's here today, but he argues that the larger number of spies killed in Cork relative to the rest of the country can be explained by those who were in the leadership of the Cork 1 Brigade, basically Sean O'Hegarty, OC, Florence O'Donoghue, who was the intelligence officer and adjutant. The figures, however, show considerable variation across the Cork brigades. There are much more in Cork 1. But I would argue this was also comes down to different circumstances in each, with each having different weak and strong points. Cork 1 Brigade had more opportunities to gather intelligence. It was the centre of the 6th Division, the British military unit in the south of Ireland, based in Cork City. So that gave great opportunities to harvest intelligence, which of course the Cork 1 Brigade did very effectively with a number of moles inside the barracks and of course many more outside. And of course the Cork 1 Brigade had, although it had more opportunities, it also had to cope with a far more formidable British military presence in the Cork 1 area than in the other brigade areas. There were much more British soldiers and auxiliaries in Cork 1 area
than in West Cork or indeed in North Cork. And Cork 1 confronted this threat aggressively to reduce the flow of information to Crown forces. It made it more difficult for them to identify the IRA. And a key strategy in the IRA, in the British campaign, they had to identify who was in the IRA. And of course that had to be done through intelligence. So it's rightly been called an intelligence war by a number of historians. That was a very important part of it. And this is the context which we need to read the whole disappearances strategy and the whole business of killing spies and informers, which looks so brutal from a contemporary perspective. Disappearances also took place to prevent British reprisals on Republicans. Moreover, in an organisation without formal prisons, it also meant they could interrogate prisoners before death. They could get more information out of the prisoners before killing them. And the manifestly higher incidence of disappearances is also symptomatic of the manifestly higher resort to violence by both sides in Cork relative to other counties, taking death as the most measurable comparator. Both sides in Cork were willing to take it to a higher level in the War of Independence when it came down to the business of killing people. 23% of all the deaths in the War of Independence took place in County Cork. 530 killings have been identified in the county so far. And you've got to see that as part of this wider pattern. These smaller number of disappearances must be seen in the wider context of that killing zone, if you like, compared to most counties in Ireland which were relatively quiet. Finally, we need to put the scale of disappearances in Cork in context. And this is evident if we note that almost 4 times as many people were disappeared in County Cork between 1920 and 22 than during the entire period of the Northern Troubles, where disappearances and locating bodies for relatives has been an important part of the efforts to bring closure to the conflict. There were 16 disappearances in the Northern Troubles. There were 62 in County Cork in a much shorter period of 3 years. And I think that gives you an interesting comparison of the scale of the disappearances in County Cork. Now this, in my view, makes it one of the darker, unresolved aspects of the IRA campaign in this period. I think it was as bad as it got for the old IRA. I think this, rather than sectarianism, was the skeleton in the cupboard that we need to really take out of the cupboard and scrutinise in detail. And making comparisons between the old IRA and the provisional IRA, this looks rather bad for the old IRA, which usually comes out of these comparisons much more favourably. The provisional IRA, which disappeared 16 people in the Northern Troubles, when we compare this to County Cork alone, the IRA disappeared 62 in these years. An all-Ireland assessment would raise this figure somewhat. And this starkly illustrates, in my view, the darkest aspect of the IRA campaign in the Irish Revolution, when it came down to killing people. In terms of killing, this, I think, was the darkest aspect of the campaign. Thank you. Thank you.